Today we're reviewing a hand from the Scoop main event played by its winner, Mario Mosboeck. In this video, we're going to compare the analysis of two men, Mario and his coach, the legendary Fedor Holz, and two machines, GTOx and Odin. For those of you that are not familiar with it, Odin is a relatively new tool that allows users to analyze pre-solved simulations across many different spots. Now, I have no affiliation with Odin, but I do have a bit of history with its founder, Rory Young. About a year and a half ago, we had some discussions about potentially collaborating, but at the time, I was already working on GTOx, so nothing ever materialized. But it is cool to see his vision come to reality, and although I haven't tried Odin out yet, it seems to be a pretty slick tool.
Okay, I middle position against hijack, 6-6-5 flop.
So I'm not quite sure what stage of the tournament we're in here, but Mario is at around 52 big blinds, and he opens in the low jack with 7-8 of hearts, and villain calls in the hijack, and everyone else folds. I note here that there are ICM indicators next to the players' names, but since neither of these guys discuss ICM implications in this hand, we're going to just use a chip EV analysis. Based on these positions and stack sizes, here are the default preflop sims chosen by GTOx. A couple things to note here is that this default sim is from a 9-handed game with an 11.1% ante and a 2.41x open, whereas the actual game is 8-handed with a 12.8% ante and Mario raised to 2.15x. So we could make some adjustments to the ranges to account for the differences if we wanted to be super precise. When we compare GTOx's default ranges to Odin's ranges, we see that they're relatively close. It appears that Odin's ranges are based on an 8-max game with a 2.5x open, so you would expect to see some slight differences, which is the case, but overall they contain most of the same combos.
So my thought process on the flop is, what am I achieving with different sizings? Here with a small size, his range is pretty condensed and doesn't have many weak hands. So yes, it lacks the top part, it lacks ace-king, it lacks aces, kings, queens, it sometimes lacks checks, but it hardly ever has king-10 off, for example. So if I bet small, I'd have very little fold equity here. On the other hand, I think with a big sizing, he has a hard time defending with this exact part with like king-queen in diamonds, king-jack in hearts. Hands like this, even ace highs. So especially with a hand that benefits from folding out higher cards, I would say that with this specific hand we have somewhere around 2/3 to, I'm not sure if we go as big as pot, but somewhere around 2/3 to 80% on the flop, and I go with that.
Yeah, I'm also in my mind, I'm visualizing a bit around, I think there's two bigger parts that it's polarizing towards to, and it's like you have the threshold where does he struggle with like a majority of his range, which is he flats the king jack of hearts, he flats the the ace 8 of hearts, stuff like that, where it's like, okay, that struggles against a certain size. Then he has the king jack, like the overcard backdoor type of stuff, and then he has the pairs. And I think you got to think about, okay, what are the hands that the medium to strong, when do they start to struggle, right? If he has pocket fours, like what do they struggle against? And so I'm just trying to build these, like, okay, if he has a flush draw, it's going to be a very large size, like couldn't even go all in, like you barely can't go that. If he has a pair, then if it's an under pair, then it's like a medium to large size, and if it's an over pair, also again is in this. So I build these categories. So you have this really large size against his 7s, 8s, and flush draws. You have which is kind of draw. And then I'm thinking, okay, is there this hand? And I think there's definitely these type of hands, because if I have pocket jacks, no spade, like I want to start bombing this spot because he has no aces, he has no kings, he has no queens, he should not have. It's like pure 3 bets pre-flop. So it's like, okay, if I have pocket jacks, fire. Like, yes, he has pocket 5 sometimes, he has pocket 6s sometimes, but I'm going to build this really big bet size against his flush draws and over pairs. And then I'm looking at, kind of the next strongest part, which is I want to attack his pocket 4s, I want to attack his ace jack, I want to So you're going to have this sizing as well. And then you're going to have this sizing as well where you just attack his king jack of hearts, you know, like 2 overcards, no backdoor, stuff like that. So I think you're going to see kind of 3 poles of sizings that you will use here. And I think it's probably also going to be just frequency distributed between these different sizes. But I think there's going to be a smaller sizing. I think there's going to be a larger sizing, and the larger sizing can be pretty large. So that's what I assume.
We even go as big as pot, a little bit over pot, and exactly as you said, like we see very clearly that 9s through queens just benefit a lot from charging all the overpairs because they never fold or can just not fold, and we start putting money in the pot against the flush draws as well. Here with 8-7, we do mix it, we go more for the check, but I also, if we look at we go mostly for 80 or 100%.
Let me actually now, right, I formulated a hypothesis, and now I just want to showcase how I improve my thinking process. Right, so I formulated a hypothesis. I said there, I think there's going to be a large bet sizing and that there's going to be a smaller bet sizing. And now what is very clear is that I had a flaw in my thinking, and now it's very imminent looking at this, what my flaw was. And my flaw was that I overestimated the equity advantage. And looking at this range, it becomes super clear actually, is like this small bet sizing would exist if you would have a stronger range, but you don't. So the in-position player actually has relatively quite many pairs. So you don't really want to bet the small sizing in a relatively strong in-position range. So that was just my flaw in thinking, is like I significantly overestimated the equity advantage of the in-position player. Just even not, I didn't consciously like very much think about that. If I would have had that thought process, I probably would have come to the conclusion that it's probably going to be no small bet sizing, because all these small bets are just going to be checks because you don't have a strong enough range to support that. And so there's these, you know, you saw how I created these different logics of how I built this bet sizing. But if your opponent has a stronger range than you, it doesn't really make sense to challenge his range with a small bet, because you're just putting money in against a stronger range. In terms of equity, stronger range. So you have lots of no hit hands as well. You have lots of queen 10 hearts, queen 9 hearts, more than he does. So that's why you will build this big betting range, because you do have these 10s plus that just want to fire, or 9s plus, you probably better to say. But the part where I talked about the smaller bet size, that doesn't exist, because that's just the thinking was right in terms of we could if we would have an advantage, but we don't, so it's just checks. And you will see this very often, that if you don't have the advantage, then it will just be a checking range that builds around a check raising, check calling range. And if you do have the advantage, it would just build kind of it charges your opponent. Yeah, so if you put in a tighter range for us, you will start to see smaller bets with a higher frequency, just to charge his king jack. But right now we can't charge because we have more king 7 and we have more queen 9 and so on. So we just want to protect our VP-IPing range more to see turns, to see rivers. So that's type of the dynamic you will see very often. And we got to welcome Thompson, our stream team member. What's up, Mammoth as well. So some people joining. Welcome to our review session number 3. We're looking at 5-6-6 with a flush draw.
I'm not sure what I did chose. I went for 2/3. I think I should go a little bit bigger and check it higher frequency. I would probably have betted too much this combination in game. I would have overdone it a little bit. He calls turn pairs, so I go for 5 blinds on the flop. In position calls, and we see he still calls some king 10 hearts, king jack in hearts, king queen in diamonds. I would assume that he might fold some of these already on the flop.
Yeah, totally. I actually don't think exploitatively that this is overdoing it. It's important to understand that you are at a disadvantage here, so you want to build more around your checking range and protect that to just see, like, to realize more of the equity. That's the probably the key flaw in your thinking. Like you probably also overestimated, like, oh, you saw 7-8 and you were like, oh, it's just, it has equity, I gotta bet this hand type of thinking. But it's actually more like embedding it in your overall range thinking and your overall range equity thinking. And then you will see, I need to put a lot of 9s plus in my checking range as well. So I can't just pure bet it, which also means you can't just pure bet 7-8. So that's probably the next level thinking we need to extract from here on out.
The flop comes 6-6-5 two-tone and Mario c-bets around 58% of pot. Right up front, there are a few things that we should take note of about how both Mario and Fedor approach analyzing this hand. First, although they're using a GTO tool, before even opening it up, they proactively think about how they would construct their own strategies. Then they compare that logic to what the sim is showing, and finally they refine the parts of their logic that are inconsistent with the optimal strategy. This is a type of deliberative process that I also very strongly encourage, because regardless of the subject matter, active learning will always be much more effective than passive learning, and I think there are many out there that use solvers to simply look up to see if they played their specific hand right, which is definitely passive learning. Secondly, both guys didn't just evaluate how Mario's specific hand should be played. Before even talking about Mario's hand, they first considered how their range as a whole should be played, and they evaluated sizings based on the incentives of Mario's various hand classes against the assumed range of villain. They noted that on the one hand, Mario has some advantages in the top part of the range, particularly with overpairs and ace-king type of hands, which both guys agree justifies a large bet. On the other hand, as Mario pointed out, Villain's cold calling range is condensed and doesn't have many weak combos, which translates into an overall equity advantage of 52 to 47%. When we hone in on the middle part of the range, with hands at around 40 to 70% equity, we see that nearly 70% of Villain's range makes up this tier compared to only around 40% for Mario. This is because a cold calling range will generally be tighter and centered around pocket pairs that will have decent equity. And as Fedor also points out, Mario actually has more complete whiffs on this board, such as Queen 10 of hearts and Queen 9 of hearts. These types of hands definitely could benefit from getting folds, but they won't wield a lot of fold equity against a stronger in-position range when using a smaller sizing. And since Mario does not have the advantage throughout the range, and Villain actually has a proportional advantage in quads and full houses, Mario doesn't have sufficient combos in his range to support using a very large sizing with high frequency. Accordingly, we see that the solver is primarily allocating combos between two actions: a check due to the equity disadvantage and being out of position, and a large bet because of the overall nut advantage. So checking on this type of low board with 7-8 is actually the higher frequency play in Mario's shoes, and we see that the EV regret for checking the entire range is just 0.4% of the pot. Now between GTO check and Odin, we see that overall the ranges are playing relatively similarly, but there are some differences. Of course, one of the reasons for these differences are the divergent preflop ranges, as we noted earlier. Additionally, Odin has more available bet sizings, as it includes a 125% pot option, which we see the solver actually prefers on this board. Another reason for the differences is that since Odin is essentially a library of pre-solved sims, the pot and bet sizings used in this sim will be different than the specific pot and bet sizings from the actual hand. That is, the way this type of sim viewer works is that it will match the actual action from the game to the closest sim in its library, but of course you can't solve for all actions, so there will be some discrepancies in the strategies. On the other hand, although GTO Check does have a library of pre-solved sims, its main function is that of a solver, so it uses the actual pot and bet sizings from the hand history. But the overall flavor of both sims is relatively close. And in Villain's shoes, we do see that both Odin and GTO Check are doing a lot of defending in position against this bet by Mario, including with overcard floats, which perhaps explains why the solver prefers the larger sizing here in Mario's shoes to apply max pressure against these types of hands.
On the turn, my thought process was that it's good to unblock the flush draws On the turn, if it busts in the river, I can bet it through. But on the turn, I might get some fold from ace highs and king highs, and 7-8 is just one of the weakest hands that I can have that still have equity and benefit from folding out king and ace highs. So my perception was that it would be one of my best bluff candidates, and therefore I think I went with a 70% sizing. He calls, and as you can see here, it's around 2/3 to 80%. So it's fine both. It shows like it's sometimes betting big on the flop, sometimes betting big on the turn. But what I need to be careful is that if I do that every time, then it's just way overdue. It might still work. It might still be good. But I think if someone is aware of that I do that too much, then they just are able to call down way too much.
The turn is the 5 of diamonds, double pairing the board, and Mario continues with around a 68% pot bet. His stated rationale for this move is that 7-8 is one of his weakest hands, but it also has good equity, and so he decides to barrel, targeting primarily ace and king high floats. In essence, Mario's thought process first involved gauging the relative strength of his hand, determining that it had low showdown ability, which in GTOx we refer to as a hand in the non-realizing class, and this class's primary incentive is to bluff. Then, Mario assessed that his particular hand was a stronger bluff candidate within this class because of the incremental equity provided by the draw. And we see that both Odin and GTOx do fire this combo with relatively high frequency. However, both tools check this combo some of the time as well, which prompts Mario to caution against bluffing draws 100% of the time in this type of spot to avoid over-aggressing. And it will often be the case that the solver will split its draws into two distinct lines, a passive line and an aggressive line. However, the exact allocations for these individual draws will often be very complex and impossible to memorize. So let's see if we can devise a simplified yet balanced strategy among these combos using GTOx tools. When we isolate our unmade hands with a draw, we see that the EV regrets for checking or betting 2/3 pot or full pot are all relatively low. This means that all of these combos are mostly indifferent between these options. So in a spot like this, to avoid becoming overly aggressive or overly passive, we could try to achieve some semblance of balance by simply randomizing among all of these actions. This type of strategy will keep our range disguised, and it also gives us the ability to make very strong hands in various branches of the game tree.
And yeah, for me on the arriving on the river, I think flop seems both options fine, turn seems still both options fine, but on the river I think with 7-8, with all the flush draws busted, I think I have a pretty clear jam and going for it.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? You gotta watch out. Like, if you would give a solver too many bluffs on flop and turn, it won't give you this output. So be very careful with this idea of, oh, you know, like I maybe overbluffed flop, I maybe overbluffed turn, but now in the river this hand has to go in. It's like, no, the frequency has to be right. So if you bluffed, you know, 200% too many bluffs on the flop and 200% too many bluffs on the river, you have to give up a lot of hands on the river. And so that's just, you know, because then you easily fall in this trap of like, oh, I just got here with his hand, so now I gotta bluff it. But then it's like just a pure call for the imposition guy. And, you know, so it's not just automatically because you got with a, you know, bad hand that will lose 100% at showdown to the river that you then gotta bluff it. No, it's more important to first think about what's the correct frequency according to your value hands, because these are the drivers of what you can bluff. It's not how many bluffs you have, it's how much value you have.
That's a good point. I thought I have all the checks 10s plus, but as you can see, if we leave the weighted out, it becomes very little combos. Like in this specific, like with this specific sizing, we arrive at very, very little combos on the river. I ended up jamming, and he didn't really have a hard decision. And he pre-called the aces. So Solver says the 5%, he rolled the 5%, called aces, and got me there. So
actually take a look at it's 7-8 is, for some reason he doesn't really like 7-8 so much. Yeah, if you look at it, like it's not one of his favorite bluffs, and I'm not entirely sure why he doesn't like the 8 so much. I mean, obviously this now is it's always a bit misleading to look at the unweighted strategy, but 7-8, I think because of blockers and the equilibrium, you will see something like that, because every hand that doesn't have enough showdown value is just jamming, and every hand, it's so.
I think it's mostly because 8s are folding, so he way rather jams 7 than 7-8. So that is the logic. So I think 7s are a higher frequency folding than 8s in reality. Like most people don't have the process.
It makes 7-8 bad, right? If 7s and 8s are the highest frequency folds, like you want to have 9-10.
Yeah.
So that's important to understand, that oftentimes on the river, then now this is the worst hand you can bluff. It's good that it doesn't have spades, but it's like much worse than king queen, like rather triple barrel king queen of hearts, because you block 6 combos of the most, like the 100% call flop, the 100% call turn, 100% pre-flop call, and 100% fold river or high frequency fold river. Like, don't underestimate that.
The river is the 3 of diamonds, and Mario jams, citing 2 things. 1, he has no showdown value, and 2, the flush draw is busted. However, one thing that Fedor points out right away is that not all trash hands can simply jam here, especially if Mario is over bluffing flops and turns. And we see that even at the equilibrium, where a balanced flop and turn bluffing range was implemented, the solver is giving up on many unmade hands. We see that these combos comprise almost 60% of Mario's range, so to avoid overbluffing, we need to differentiate among this class if we want to play in a less exploitable way. So how do we refine our logic here? Well, let's isolate our weakest combos, which we see are splitting between betting and checking around 50-50. And if we examine the blocker and unblocker scores for this class, we see a pretty clear pattern emerge. When we focus on the hands with the highest unblocker scores, we see these combos are shoving nearly 90% of the time, with an EV regret of 1.3% of the pot. And when we focus on the hands with the lowest unblocker scores, we see these combos are checking nearly 80% of the time, with an EV regret of 0.9%. And the primary distinction between these two groups is quite obvious. The hands with the higher unblocker scores mostly do not contain a spade, and the hands with the lower unblocker scores all do contain a spade. Of course, this is because most of Villain's weakest combos are missed spade draws, which means we don't want to hold a spade in Mario's shoes, since that will slightly decrease the probability that Villain has a missed flush draw that will autofold to this shove. And in contrast, when we don't have a spade, it slightly increases the probability that our opponent was on a spade draw, which means we should be more inclined to bluff. So one very simplified strategy that we could employ in this type of spot that is generally balanced and consistent with GTO is that we could shove all of our hands lower than king high that do not contain a spade, and check all of our hands lower than king high that do contain a spade. And if we want to refine our strategy even further, we can, as Fedor and Mario did, evaluate Villain's likely folding range, since that will be the primary target for our bluffing combos. So here we see that against this large, nearly full pot shove, at equilibrium, Villain should be folding a bit over 50% of its range, as indicated by this fold leverage value. So let's isolate the bottom 50th percentile of Villain's range to see how it's comprised. And here we see that the most prevalent combos in this class are pocket 8s, which, as Mario points out, is why 8x is actually one of the worst bluffing combos among this non-spade group. And as Fedor posited, King Queen of Hearts is actually a better bluffing hand, despite having higher rank and more showdown ability. So an even more refined strategy could be one where we bluff Mario's specific hands some of the time and give up with it some of the time based on randomization. So who wins this edition of Man vs. Machine? Well, obviously, if you had the ability to call Fedor at any time and ask him how to play a hand for a buck or two, that would be a dream scenario. But unfortunately, none of us have this type of access, so with all due respect to Fedor, Mario, and Rory, I'm going to have to give this one to GTOx because there is simply no human or tool on this planet that can do this type of detailed quantitative analysis at this level. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.